All right. Thanks for joining us today. Just have a presentation here put together about sugar-based seltzers primarily. Going to run through, just help everybody brush up on some new definitions or regulations, and then we're going to roll through to some new trends in the industry. I've got, as you probably know, at Country Malt, we work with vendor partners around the world, and our in-house flavor suppliers are Mon. They've been nice enough to join us today. I've got Heather Wujek and Natasha on. Heather, Natasha, can you introduce yourselves? Heather, you want to go first?
Sure. Can you hear me okay, Grant?
I can hear you.
Awesome. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Heather Wujek. As Grant says, I'm an account manager for Man Flavors. I'm here to assist him today, and hopefully between myself, Natasha, and Grant, we'll be able to answer any questions you guys have, especially as far as using flavors in this space. So thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Natasha, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I am Natasha Simpson. I've been in the flavor industry for almost 24 years, and we do a ton of technical support and flavor support for these various different applications. And we're looking forward to any additional flavor questions you may have about any of the slides and the things that Grant is working on. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Let's get into it. All right. Seltzer flavor, compliance, and innovation. So, as I mentioned already, goals for today, want to define and talk about the processing of flavorings. We'll go through the flavor regulations for the TTB and the FDA. And lastly, probably what most people came for is the using flavorings in beer and hard seltzer and 2021 trends. But most importantly, there's some regulations with seltzer and using flavorings that I want craft brewers to be aware about. Especially the smaller craft brewers out there that are just getting into this. It's just a little bit more involved than beer. So we're going to run through that. Let's talk about FDA flavor regulations. So there's lots of acronyms thrown around in the flavor industry. Natural flavors, FT&F, means that all flavor material present must contain a natural source of the named material, not including the solvent. And then we have natural flavors WAMF. So natural flavors WAMF must contain a natural source of the named material, but may also contain other natural flavor materials. These other natural flavor materials do not need to be derived from the named material. And I've got a handy chart about this in a few slides, so we'll go through that. Any products containing artificial ingredients cannot have WAMF in the name. So, if you're trying to stay natural, WAMF is fine. No artificial ingredients there. And I don't mean to bash artificial flavorings here. We'll get into that a little bit later. Sometimes they can really be a benefit. So we'll go through that too. Natural and artificial flavors NNA. So these must contain a natural source of the named material, but may also contain artificial flavor materials. Then you have natural type flavors. Natural type flavors are ones that do not contain the named ingredient, but taste and smell like it. And I'm going to delineate this with a chart here in just a minute, but I just want to run through the definitions. Then you have artificial flavors. The predominant flavor is from the artificial ingredients. Non-flavor ingredients do not impact the flavor name. And so when I say that, I mean the carrier. Most of these, really all of these flavors have, there's certain flavor molecules, and then the rest of it is a carrier. And you have to have that carrier in order for the flavor to come through in the end. So you have natural and artificial flavors with a 0.1% artificial top note. And what's interesting here, and what I'm getting at here, is that the FDA and the TTB have different regulations. Flavors containing not more than 0.1% artificial top note are considered TTB natural when used in alcoholic beverages. The calculation of the amount of artificial material does not include artificial vanillin, ethyl vanillin, artificial maltol, nor ethyl maltol. And I'll talk about that here in a minute. There's some specific limits for those, so just something to be aware of if you're going for vanilla flavors. They're just a little stricter than some of the other categories. And then lastly, when flavors are submitted for a drawback of tax, the name should comply with the above TTB requirements. Natural and artificial, even though some natural and artificial flavors with 0.1% artificial top note may be considered natural when used in alcoholic beverages. So that's really the difference there between the TTB and the FDA. Natural and artificial flavors with greater than 0.1% artificial top note considered for alcohol beverage labeling purposes to be artificial. And really, artificial top notes aren't as common in this industry as they were in the past, but I just want people to be aware. They don't, work with your flavor supplier, because a lot of them don't even use them anymore, but it's important to know for TTB guidelines. So here's a little bit more about the vanillin limits that I talked about. TTB has limitations for artificial vanillin. Really you can use natural vanilla beans here instead if you want to go even higher. But I will say that at these limits, it's a lot of vanilla flavor. So you shouldn't have a problem, but it's just stricter than other flavors. So, and this is also in the finished alcoholic beverage, not in the flavor. The actual amount present in the beverage will be calculated based on the use rate of the flavor. So here's the chart that I kept promising a moment ago. Mon was nice enough to provide this. It makes it a little bit more straightforward. So a natural orange flavor, only oranges. Natural orange flavor, WOMF. So it's the same. It has orange flavor, but then it uses other flavors to amplify those. Then you have natural flavor orange type, which is where there's no oranges in it. It's, you can use these other things. It tastes like an orange, smells like an orange. There's no orange in it. And then you have artificial orange flavor, where and then you have natural and artificial orange flavor. So it still has oranges in it, but then it has, something else too. So a lot of these really, they matter for the FDA, and they matter for your packaging, like your canning, for instance. If you're going to put a beautiful picture of like oranges on your can or on your label, FDA rules are basically that you need to actually be using something that has oranges in it, like the natural orange flavor or a natural orange flavor WOMF. The flavors that we have at Country Malt, I'm going to use us as an example because I know us best. Most of them are natural flavors and natural flavors WOMF. All of the flavors we carry except peach and apricot are TTB natural. So let's get into some more TTB regulations. A malt beverage requires both malt and hops, surprisingly, relatively small amount. 25% total malt, 7.5 pounds per 100 barrel for a malt beverage. A flavored malt beverage, however, doesn't necessarily require malt and doesn't necessarily require hops. There's a list of TTB substitutes. One of them is dextrose, which is how we're seeing a lot of craft breweries make seltzer. They're using dextrose and water and fermenting that as a base. Using flavor extracts or removing flavor with carbon filtering is an IRC beer. Sometimes a flavored malt beverage isn't, it's not defined by the state, so it's treated like a wine. If you're using flavor extracts or you're removing color with carbon filtering, it's an IRC beer, so a TTB formula is required. And then flavors must be registered with the TTB and have an FIDS number. We can provide those. For instance, work with whatever flavor house you're using to get that information. There may be a tax credit in the form of a drawback. I know I mentioned that a few slides ago. This is probably not a big deal unless you're a larger craft brewery. Depending on your use, if you're smaller, it may not be worth it. But a tax credit is possible if you're using, and you're already paying tax on it once. So this can give you a credit if you're using a lot of extract. So it might be something to look into. And well, keep going. So FDA regulations are a little different, but they're not something to be scared about. You will have to get a nutrition label for these. IRC beer, most sugar-based hard seltzers are considered IRC beer. That's Internal Revenue Code. So sugars, like I mentioned a minute ago, sugars are considered a malt substitute like dextrose. There are still surprisingly considered beer, so they're not subject to TTB COLA. COLA is Certificate of Label Approval or Exemption. But they do fall under the FDA labeling regulations. So you'll need a nutritional label and a Surgeon General warning. And there's rules around the ingredient list. There are some, it's not all bad having to do extra work to get the label on your packaging. You will be able to, well, providing you meet the requirements, you'll be able to get some marketing in there. You'll be able to say it's non-GMO, it's gluten-free, and then you can put the flavoring info on it. But that's how we're seeing a lot of hard seltzers being labeled, and oftentimes it's a selling point. So it's not such a bad thing to be able to put that on the packaging. All right, now that we're done with the regulations, we can get into some best practices. For craft seltzer production, it's dextrose and sucrose and water fermentations. Typically, so you're just making a sugar solution in your kettle and you're knocking that out into your fermenter. You get to skip a lot of the beer making process, so you can produce these pretty quickly. One thing though is that these types of fermentations, they have no yeast nutrient. It's basically a yeast desert here. So you really have to make sure that your yeast nutrients are good to go. There's a lot of them out there. There's some newer ones that are in a tablet format that make dosing them a lot easier than measuring out something granular like they have been in the past. And then, so that's one way to do it. You can buy the nutrients separately and add them in. Most of the nutrients, it's really a source of nitrogen, but there's some micronutrients like zinc, magnesium, calcium that are also important for the yeast. And then what I'm seeing is a lot of brewers don't know about this, but some of the larger craft seltzer makers are using a turbo yeast, and these turbo yeast have the nutrient already built in. Depending on if you like them, if they make a good seltzer for you, it might be an option, and it would save you a lot of money versus buying the nutrients separately. The nutrients can be kind of expensive. So once you've fermented your sugar water solution, you need to filter it. This is commonly done with activated charcoal filter cartridges. I've got some pictures here. The circular one fits inside a lenticular filter, and then there's also sheets available. You can work with your typical filter folks on those. They're pretty common at this point, and you just need to know the measurements of your housing, and you can get the activated charcoal ones. This is what I tend to recommend, and what I don't claim to be the absolute expert here, but I've seen this work out on the craft side more than once very successfully, of using these activated charcoal filter cartridges to just get a really neutral seltzer base. So when you're adding all these nutrients and you're fermenting the sugar solution, it can taste kind of hot. You can have, like some people say, fusel alcohol flavor to it. So it's not really, it's kind of harsh. So you really need to do something, and the activated charcoal filters will transform them, in a big way. But I have seen some craft brewers on a smaller scale bubble CO2 through the bottom of the tank, through the bottom of the cone. So basically drop the yeast cone after fermentation and then just bubble CO2 through the bottom of the cone, and vent over the top of the tank. And you can scrub a lot of flavor and aroma out that way without, the capital investment of doing charcoal filter cartridges. If you're one of those brewers that's, relies on, say, Kesosol or a silica dioxide product for filtering, and you just use a unitank, then bubbling CO2 for you might work. It really just depends on the recipe. If you're bubbling CO2, typically the tablet format of adding the yeast nutrients might work out better for you than going the distiller's yeast method, just in terms of harshness, right, and reducing that. So using the nutrients, tends to give you a little bit less harsh seltzer base from what I've seen. And then if you combine that with something more quick and dirty, like bubbling CO2 through the bottom, you can get some good results that way. Preventing oxidation for hard seltzer is not as critical as typical craft beer. There's no malt, there's no hops, so there's really no fatty acids or lipids that oxidize. Still, though, you might want to consider using a stabilizer like citric acid or potassium sorbate or potassium metabisulfite, something like that, to especially when you add a flavor extract, you might want to consider using something like that just to further enhance the shelf life. But you should probably develop an SOP around your seltzer that's separate from beer, because the DO just doesn't matter as much. All right, let's talk about dosing flavoring. When and where in the process to dose flavoring. So many flavor extracts, and I think a lot of folks don't realize this, they have sugar in them, sucrose. Many of them do, but there are some that have none. Extracts that contain sugar are typically best used in the fermenter towards the end of fermentation. They're pourable. You can add them in just like you would a dry hop in the top of the tank. By adding at the end of fermentation, you get that churn from the yeast, just like you would a dry hop. So you get some mixing in there. So I pulled a picture from one of ours that we have, which is the natural raspberry flavor Womf, and it has 32 grams of sugar in it. The overall usage to get flavor impact of these, you're going to have to test them with a micro pipette, of course. But even though that's kind of a high percentage, it seems, for that flavor, 32, the small amount that you're adding, it probably won't matter. But just to be safe, I recommend something like this raspberry that has a high amount of sugar in it. Add that in towards the end of fermentation. I don't know off the top of my head, but many of them will have 0 sugar in them. So just something that I want people to be aware of. Work with your flavor house, work with your sales rep, and get this information prior to using the extract and developing the recipe. So let's talk about ways to dose flavor extracts. You can use a micro pipette to dose finished beer on a small scale first. This is really the best way. There's, a micro pipette, you can spend as much or as little as you want to on them. I think you can get some of them pretty cheaply for like $50, and they can go up to $300. But it's worth it because you can rapidly just test different dosages. You get your little tips. If you've got a lab, if you don't already have one of these, you'll need it for some other stuff as well in your lab. But it's nice just to pull a bunch of samples of like let's say the base beer, and then go to town, just test out different dosages of the flavors. And it's usually not hard if you work with your flavor supplier to get a bunch of samples to be able to do this. And then you can develop a dosing SOP based on that. So I already mentioned it already, but on a small scale, it's often easiest just to dump flavors in the top of the tank. I like to use 1 degree Plato above terminal gravity just as a starting point, because there's going to be a little bit more fermentation, and you'll get some mixing effect there. However, extracts with low or no sugar could be added after filtration, since there's no fermentables on those. So just read your nutrition information of your extracts. So adding flavor extracts at the start of fermentation or hot side, I don't typically recommend that. You'll probably lose a lot of the volatile flavor and aromas this way, just through fermentation, or through hot side just from temperature. So just make it easy on yourself. Treat it like a dry hop. That's the way I recommend. So I wanted to jump into some stuff in this presentation that craft brewers may not know about, or smaller craft brewers may have never heard of. So these flavor houses have other products. They have masking products, and these do all kinds of stuff. They lower the intensity of other flavors, like say your hot alcohol flavors from a fermentation, and they can cover up, they just cover up harsh base flavors, and they are used in large seltzer companies use them. They're also used a lot by CBD companies out there. These are popular for them. They can be purchased separately, and sometimes they're built into certain flavors. And then really, like, certain flavors have masking abilities just on their own. Tropical fruit flavors tend to have really strong masking abilities just by their flavor intensity. So a couple things that flavor maskers can do. They can extend or intensify sweetness. They can block bitter flavors, and they can mask undesirable aftertastes, like, let's say, a harsh seltzer fermentation, for instance. So some other things, if you overuse a masking product, they can give you a creamy taste. They can give you a powdery taste. And, probably our least favorite as craft beer makers, they can give you a buttery taste. But this is really only when they're overused. So just to give you some idea of these, they're incredibly potent. They have a relatively low usage rate, like less than 0.1%. And then I know that some of the hard seltzer makers out there, they're using less than 0.05%. So a little goes a long way with these, but they can just really round out your seltzer beverage. So this is another one that I thought was interesting. Wanted to include that craft brewers haven't really latched onto yet. They're not really new for the flavor industry, but as you probably know, craft brewing has always been about using everything natural, and that's great and all, but these products can just do more than I think what people are aware of. So I just wanted to include them. If anybody remembers the Sobe beverages from the 90s, that would be an example. So a flavor cloud extract, it's an oil suspension, and it can provide a hazy juice-like appearance. Like, it can make that opaque color like some of these have. And they still declare as a natural flavor, depending on the specific flavor. So they're easy to use. Some examples, the Sobe drinks, they're used a lot in flavored vodkas, but they work great in a hard seltzer. They haven't been tested extensively in traditional beer, but when I first heard about these, it kind of got my gears turning. You could use something like this to probably get a stable haze in a traditional beer. It's kind of a new frontier for products to get a stable haze. It could be nice. You wouldn't have to use typical high protein malt or other adjuncts to get the haze. You could just use an extract. So I wanted to go into some trends just for anybody out there that's thinking of diving into seltzers, hard seltzers. Um, Exotic and tropical flavors have just been huge. I've got another slide about that. We'll dive more into that next. But there's so many flavor options out there, and of them, just one trend that we've really noticed is that the tropical flavors are booming. And then this other trend that's happening in our craft beverage industry is better for you and functional. Some of the seltzers will market the vitamin C content, and like hard kombucha is another example. Things that consumers just see as being better for you have really taken off with the flavors they use, using botanical flavors, cucumber, lemongrass, chamomile tea. All of those have just become really popular over the past couple of years, not just in seltzers, but in like ready to drink spirits, like pre-mixed cocktails with a spirit base. So here's some more info, just some sales numbers from about using these tropical fruit flavors. I mean, craft brewers aren't really tropical fruits, or we tend to just get them through hops, but this is a way that you could potentially boost those flavors without using so much, expensive hop materials and having the waste absorbed in hops. So you can see guava, 143% or 140% growth in the last 3 years. Passion fruit, 32% growth. And these are just, flavor growth sales numbers from the company we work with, Mon. So my point in all this is, if you're not making a hard seltzer, if you're thinking about it, consider using exotic fruit flavoring.
I just wanted to add, Grant, and just to your point, we're seeing this more and more where brands are leaning more towards remarkable and unusual flavor hybrids, just to try to, remain competitive and top of market and to help create more of that complete flavor experience for their consumers. So that's why you see some of these kind of unusual pairings here. That is something we're seeing growing in popularity. And of course, those strange but unusual flavor hybrids tend to be draw more attention to consumers nowadays. So we are seeing that grow in extreme popularity. Just wanted to add.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you would know better than I would there, Heather. Thanks. Let's see. Some other trends that are kind of on the horizon, and Heather, feel free to jump in again here. Hard punch, hard lemonade seems to be making a comeback, but this time low cal, sort of like better BFY, better for you, like we were saying in an earlier slide. And hard kombucha is also on the rise. If you're listening to this and you don't know, kombucha is a fermented tea, and those are really becoming popular. And then something that I thought was kind of interesting is that some larger breweries are asking for bourbon barrel flavor womps. You can get your bourbon barrel flavor from an extract, and if you're a very large brewery, the amount of barrels you would need to release a bourbon barrel aged beer, it can be extremely cost prohibitive. So you can stretch that bourbon flavor just a little bit more by using like a bourbon flavor extract. And I don't think a lot of people know these exist, but they work great.
And just kind of fitting into that better for you space too, with the hard punch, hard kombucha, hard lemonades that we're seeing. I think that's where a flavor really can help come in to help drive that sweetness while still remaining under, a certain nutritional content or a certain calorie content. So that's really where we're seeing flavors play a big space too, to help still provide that in your face flavor experience without, costing the calories.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, and then lastly, this craft pre-made cocktail mixes are also on the rise. With the current state of the world, with just having labor shortages and things like that, there's not as many bartenders to go around. So what we're seeing is that you can speed up making a craft cocktail with a pre-made mix, using flavors and things like that. Heather, do you have any more info on those? Like, could you give us an example of one of those?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think just, everyone's experienced this kind of, shortage in just employees. We're seeing like restaurants and bars be hit the most. So that's where this real surge for premium mixes come in. So instead of having to make a margarita, squeeze a lime, add the triple sec, add all these different elements, it's a lot easier just to add tequila to a pre-made mix. But of course, they don't want to sacrifice in, premiumization. So it has to still be of high quality and, true to the consumer experience. So that's really where we're seeing this space kind of shift, just because of what we're seeing in the market.
Sure. Last but not least, I know coming from craft brewing that using flavors is historically is a no-no, but I think times are changing. Like, we're seeing the market really explode with beers. I'm just using this as an example, like adding crushed up cookies to a beer. You could do that by all means, but it wastes a lot of beer. So my point is, you should consider using a flavor extract as an extender here, rather than crushing up cookies and wasting 25% of the beer you just made. Maybe you could cut that back and still use the crushed up cookies, but use a flavor extract as an extender. And then also the same thing with fruit purees, where, seeing supply shortages of berries, for example, like raspberry, blueberry, things like that, in the purees, consider stretching them a little bit with flavor extracts. You're still using, say, natural raspberry puree, but use just a little bit of a flavor extract and just bring it further, waste less beer, and achieve more flavor. There's certain, we all know that certain fruit purees like peach, I'm using that as an example, are just subtle in general. So rather than buying a bunch of costly puree and having a bunch of absorption loss or something like that with a peach puree, stretch it a little bit with some peach flavor. And don't be afraid to try it. So I hope overall this presentation gives you some ideas for making your next craft beverage even better. And I hope that you come away from this knowing a little bit more about the regulations and not being afraid of them when it comes to making hard seltzers, and that you consider adding that to your lineup, because they don't seem to be going anywhere. Throughout COVID, for example, I can speak to Country Malt's sales when it comes to dextrose. Is even though beer was down for a lot of craft during COVID, it was I would say overall down. Dextrose held in there flat, using that as a sugar base for making seltzers. So they definitely seem to continue to sell, and it'll be interesting to see where we go from here, and where craft brewer minds can take this. So just leave you with that today. Any questions, feel free to email me at glawrence@countrymalt.com. That's glawrence@countrymalt.com. And I can work with if I can't answer your question, I know Heather and Natasha will be able to. So anyways, thanks for joining us today.